Hi, everyone. Welcome to this a very interesting lecture by Dr. Madhuri Ramesh. And this is the monthly lecture on food and some aspect of what we would like to say is the sociology or social anthropology of food to the Adhoc Group 3, Food, Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. Now, as most of you may or may not be aware, it's actually the youngest RC or ad hoc group of the ISS, and therefore we are still a very small collective trying to grow in numbers. And one of the purposes of having this space is so that we have scholars who have already worked on food talking to us about their research, giving us ideas about how to take things ahead, and especially for young people, young sociologists in India. So I welcome everyone, and I'm thankful to Dr. Madhuri Ramesh for agreeing to give this lecture. So, very briefly introducing our speaker, she works on nature society relations, especially with respect to biodiversity conversation. She has a PhD in conservation science and sustainability studies, Atre Mahe, and currently she teaches in the School of Development at Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. Now, today her talk is titled From Sea to Surwa, Settler Histories of the Andaman Islands. And very quickly, what Madhuri is going to talk about is the Andaman, which is an archipelago of over 300 islands with rich ecological and cultural diversity. And Ramesh will present the findings of a food waste study that they conducted amongst the settler communities of the Andaman Islands from June to November 2023. I'm sure that she is going to tell us more about it in her talk. So over to you, Madhuri. I think you can talk for 30 to 40 minutes as you feel necessary, and after that, I'll open it up to a Q&A session.
Thank you, Rizwana, for this invitation, and thanks everyone for making time at the end of a long day to attend a talk. I have a couple of slides, mostly pictures, let me assure you, but I will just walk through them as I talk about this project. Right. So today's talk is based on a food waste study that I did in the Andaman Islands, and the project was called From Sea to Surwa. The word Surwa actually comes from shorba probably, and it has to do with any gravy-based food. But interestingly, with time, it has particularly morphed into a South Indian word, which is used to indicate tamarind-based gravies. And this project was titled From Sea to Surwa because we were very interested in looking at the marine resource use of communities in the Andaman Islands. And so we focused on that kind of food connection, on that kind of nature society connection. And let me explain a bit more about what drove us to do this study. The thing with the Andaman Islands is that apart from the indigenous population, whom you cannot access very easily, there's actually a very large group of people who have historically migrated from the mainland. They call the settlers, and they are extremely dependent on marine ecosystems, which form a very important source of food. So this study, like I mentioned, is a food waste study, and which means it took a cultural and a historical approach to understand the food practices and customs of different communities. And in this study, we covered around 10 settlements and 7 different communities: the Bengali, Telugu, Tamil, Mopla, Keren, and Ranchiwala communities of the islands. I struck a bit of a bonus with the last one, the Sri Lankan Tamil community, because it just happened that my research associate Chandralekha was from the community herself. And she got really curious after a couple of months of working on this project and said, oh, when I'm going to go home for a break, I want to add something from my own community as well. So that's the only community we covered from the Nicobar Islands. The objectives of this study were to understand the ecological, historical, and cultural connections of these settler communities through, this research on food. And one of the main reasons that I was also keen on documenting recipes of the Andaman Islands was that there's been a lot of focus on fisheries per se in these islands, because marine ecosystems are so important for livelihoods and for food. And what tends to happen normally with fishery studies is that because men go out to sea and they're the ones who have a lot to say about gear and nets and fish catch, it tends to be completely dominated by male voices. So, though there have been many fishery studies in the Andamans over the years, we actually have very little understanding of what the women think and what their understanding or connection to marine resources is. So, this offered us a way of capturing the women's perspectives. And the third main reason that drove us to do this study was also that we realized that most young people in the Andaman Islands actually read absolutely mainstream textbooks on history, geography, and the environment. So they know quite a bit about mainland India, but very little, sadly, about the actual landscape in which they are living and what is around them. So we also wanted to pick a topic that would be accessible to a lot of young people, that would get them curious about the history, culture, and ecology of the place that they are living in, and maybe even get some of them to engage with the idea of doing research. So the story really begins in the 1800s, when the British Empire was looking for places to park their political prisoners, because especially after the first Indian War of Independence, or the mutiny, whichever side you belong to and label you pick, the fact was that the large jails of the United Provinces were absolutely packed to capacity. They were overflowing, and the colonial government was very worried about letting so many of these rebellious people interact with each other and be housed in the same locations. So they started looking for these remote island settlements where people could be tightly policed and, given life sentences and sent away, basically out of sight, out of circulation, and just be cut off from everyone else they knew and the social networks that they belonged to. So this search for potential places that could serve as penal colonies drove the British to occupy the Andaman Islands, specifically Port Blair. And as you can see from this map, there was also simultaneous search for penal colonies that was set up in Bencoolen, in parts of Singapore, in Malacca. And all of these were known together collectively as the Strait Island settlements. Um, and once people were convicted and sent to these places, it was as good as being dead, because there was hardly any communication if you were a prisoner, and there was certainly no chance of coming back to the mainland at any point of time. But these people eventually went on to form an extremely important labor force for the British government, because the government also later realized that they wanted to build infrastructure in these penal settlements, and that these were actually environmentally very rich in resources that the empire could tap into. So these convicts went on to form a very important source of labor, and sometimes they were in the good books of the colonial government, so in which case they could get transferred from, say, one penal colony to the other. Some of them enjoyed a slightly better degree of freedom, so they were allowed to serve as domestic servants in the British households. And all of this allowed them to interact a little bit more with each other, if not with their mainland, social groups. And one of the ways in which these convicts kind of kept the memory of the homeland or of their own cultural, identity alive was obviously through food. But collectively today, if you ask people, the settler community in the Andamans, how they identify as, it will primarily be as islanders, and there's even something called an islander identity card, and they have something called the local born association. So this islander cultural identity is something that really took shape after World War II, after independence. And this is one of the first labels that you come across when you study social groups in the islands. And as islanders, people across the board, regardless of what their place of origin was, they said that machi surwa, or this fish head curry, is one of the most important kinds of foods that they identify with what it means to be an islander. a typical islander or a typical Andaman's ka khana. And this is very interesting because this fish head curry is also, debated in Singapore as a national dish. And it's also very common in Malaysia, where it's called curry ikan. And what it basically is any kind of marine fish cooked in this spicy tamarind gravy, like I mentioned earlier. And this similarity kind of is seen across the board in these Southeast Asian penal colonies. Then in 1918, you had the original sort of first bunch of settler groups that went to the islands, who were known as the Ranchiwalas. They were actually a mix of the Gond, the Kharia, and the Munda people. The Gond and the Mundas were very well known to the British government because they were very bold, they were good warriors, and they had even, been enrolled during World War One. So the Brits were quite familiar and comfortable with this group, and many of them had been Christianized, so they were considered as conscientious laborers. And when the British government needed manpower to clear the jungles and to start felling timber, which was highly valuable, this was one of the first groups that they decided to bring over to the islands. They are collectively known in the Andamans as the Ranchiwalas because they all came from around the vicinity, and their movement was also highly facilitated by the Ranchi Jesuit mission, which even today mentions the Andaman Islands as one of their main hubs of activity. And through the Catholic mission networks, basically, these tribal communities from Chota Nagpur came to the Andaman Islands to work the forests. They also, sent back money in the form of remittances, probably one of the earliest well-documented case studies we have of that, through the Chota Nagpur Catholic Mission Bank. And this mission bank did such a good job that it survived until almost the 1960s before closing down. And so a lot of the money that was earned in the Andamans actually went back to various districts in the Chota Nagpur region, and they became there, and it also became an inviting location for many of these Ranchiwala people to come and live in the islands. And some of the interesting recipes that they shared with us were revolved around shellfish. So different kinds of clams, mussels, bivalves, basically. They use them in a range of simple recipes. And as you can see, the kitchens are also really very down to earth, no fuss kind of spaces. And the women work in the fields, they have children to look after. So the kind of recipes they shared were very doable, very quick, but also quite nutritious. And among the Ranchiwalas, the women and the children also go shellfish collecting. So this is quite a popular family activity for many of them. And you also see traces of their cultural roots because, for instance, this recipe that I have on the screen is called Kudali Sipika Lutur Putur Tarkari, and Lutur Putur is actually a Sadri word. So you also see these kinds of cultural connections coming in the naming of the recipe. And yeah, like I said, this is a whole family activity, and people across different age groups, spend their weekend going to collect shellfish. Then in 1921, you had another big wave of settlers in the form of the Mopla prisoners who had participated in the Malabar rebellion against the colonial government, and they were just shipped off to the islands again. And some features of what are distinctive about their recipes is this use of jinga or dried shrimp in 100 different ways. And in fact, one of the ladies we spoke to even now said, "Oh, you have to remember that earlier, especially, all the vegetables came from the mainland by ship, so they were terribly expensive. And it would be shiploads of the same stuff. So you would sometimes get only beetroot in the market, or you would get only turnips. And if you want to keep, especially the children in your family, interested in eating and not fussing, you had to be really innovative about what you made with very limited ingredients. And therefore, vegetarian food actually played a really small role in our diet. And we looked much more at marine resources around us, which were seasonal, which were fresh and easily accessible. So this busi jinga or this small shrimp is one of the favorite things in this community, and they cook it in a range of different ways. So there's shrimp powder, there's shrimp chutney, there's shrimp gravy. There are just various ways in which you make the same thing in order to make it attractive to the palate. In 1925, there was this third large wave of settlers who came from Myanmar. This was again through the Catholic mission connection because one of the district officials, he had an uncle who was a bishop, and the uncle again said, I can send you conscientious laborers who can help you clear the forests in the middle Andamans. And he sent across a bunch of these landless Karen people who had again been Christianized. And they were offered some small plots of land for their homestead and for these forest gardens that they traditionally have around the house. They were also allowed to grow some types of paddy, and in fact, some of them have retained that original paddy cultivar, and they have even got a GI tag for it. But that's a different story. But what I will mention today is that the Karen settlers brought a very distinctively Burmese element to the food of the islands, and by that I mean preparations that have a lot of fresh sort of fish. It's not as cooked as typical Indian recipes tend to be. So, for instance, this fish salad is a very distinctive way of preparing fish. It's literally raw fish that is used immediately, very lightly fried or steamed, and it is cooked with a bunch of vegetables, many of which are wild greens, forest greens that you find in the landscape. And this kind of pairing of marine food with a lot of fresh wild greens is very distinctive. They also make something called napi, which is a very strongly flavored fermented paste that's made from dried shrimp. And you will see resonances of this with the balchao that's cooked in Goa, and then similar fermented pastes that are eaten all over Southeast Asia. Extremely distinctive elements that again indicate the larger Indian Ocean connection between these different communities and landscapes. Then in 1949 and 1971, we had two waves of Bengali refugees from erstwhile Bangladesh. And with them, they brought again very typical Bengali cooking techniques, such as wrapping the fish in banana leaves and steaming it, and also using mustard oil as a flavoring agent. So this machar patha is very similar to what is cooked in West Bengal. But just that the Bengalis in the Andaman Islands have adapted very well to whatever resources are available to them. So, in this sense, they eat much more marine fish than typical Bengalis in the mainland would, because there are very few freshwater sources in the islands, and you have a much greater diversity of marine fish that you can consume. Um, so you see these kinds of techniques coming in. And then in the 1940s, you had World War II, and the Andaman Islands was completely occupied by the Japanese. As far as I know, none of the typical Japanese culinary techniques seem to have entered the community, because there are still a few old people who were young children and acted as translators for the Japanese, and their memories mostly revolve around extreme periods of food shortage and starvation, and the introduction of sweet potato to island food, because that was something that was very easy to grow, and the Japanese were very keen and commandeered a lot of land and labor to grow sweet potatoes to overcome the starvation, right? But there doesn't seem to have been any influence on when it comes to consumption of marine food. Then in the 1950s, fishers from Andhra, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, basically states which had large populations of marine fishing communities, were sort of promised loans and subsidies and boats if they could come to the Andaman Islands and settle down there and sort of tap into the marine resources, because by then the post-independent government had also realized that marine fish are themselves a very important economic resource, And there is this fantastic export market that extends all over Southeast Asia. So they were very keen to get in these typical traditional fishing communities to work the waters around the Andaman Islands. And the Telugu community, for instance, brought in this a technique of cooking fermented rice khichdi, which is known as the tarmadu. And this you will, I'm sure, recognize as, something that's eaten again all over Southeast Asia, but with a very fancy spelling, the kanji, right? But it's written as konji in most parts of Southeast Asia. But kanji is also the way the Tamils eat old rice, fermented rice, and it's always consumed with salted and sea-dried sort of fish, small fish like anchovies, for instance. And you see, therefore, this use of fermented rice, old rice, and consumption of fish to these coastal communities all over, and that came to the islands as well. Then in the 1970s, we had this final wave of settlers in some sense. And they were the Sri Lankan Tamils who had been offered a repatriation in India. Some of them were settled in mainland India, but quite a lot of them were offered land in Little Andamans, in some parts of South Andaman, and then in the Nicobar Islands, in Kachal, in fact, which is where my research associate came from. And they brought again these interesting techniques of using dried tuna, which is otherwise actually not very popular in the Andamans, whereas it is, commonly consumed in the Lakshadweep. And they also, brought in those typical Sri Lankan labels for the food they made, such as sambal. So these techniques are now, seen in the Andaman Islands because of this wave of settler migrations. Since, yeah, the one part of the project was to engage with the women and document their voices and understanding, we went back and shared these recipe books that we had made with the women to see what they thought of it and what their reactions were. And we're very happy to know that they engaged a lot and they were quite excited about the whole thing. We also did a series of social media posts just to get the island youth involved. And a lot of our field work was facilitated by help from Dakshin Foundation, which is an NGO that works in the Andaman Islands, as well as the Azim Premji University itself. So I'm gonna stop here and I'm happy to take questions. I have kept this talk deliberately short because I would much rather engage with whatever questions you have for me. And yeah, I'm done.
Right. Thank you so much, Madhuri, for that very interesting talk. For me, at least, it was very refreshing. And, I have a few questions, but let me be a good host and open it up to the others. And if anyone has a question, please feel free to either write it in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask the speaker. Okay, in the time that probably everyone is gathering their thoughts, I'll go ahead and ask you. One is about how do you think the questions of ecology, sustainability, and then also neoliberal capitalism come in when you look at the food habits amongst the, islanders, as they would call themselves, like you said. How do you see this relationship unfold, particularly, in such a contemporary context?
Right. I think, take the question on neoliberal capitalism first, because one of the things we had been saying, like, well, I've been in and out of the island since 2005, not, always there, but I have some sense of what has happened over this time period. And one of the things I have found is that with the increase in tourism, there's a much larger level of homogenization of food that is consumed in the islands. Because of tourist demand, tourist palettes, you now have paneer and chicken, everywhere. In every island, wherever there's a restaurant, this is what they're all switching to serving, which is a bit tragic because it's a move away from this kind of regional diversity that you used to see earlier. And there's also the aspiration aspect, right? So the more that the islanders, settlers are exposed, especially in the rural areas, to tourism and generally mainstream life and everything, the more their palates also they also want to eat the same thing. So there is a huge demand for, yeah, junk food and these kinds of very typical mainstream sort of food that's coming in. So that's a bit of a problem. The second, or at least I think it's a bit of a problem that everybody's homogeneous. The second thing that's happening is also there's a very large export market. So in a lot of places, it just seems to make more sense to sell what you catch rather than keep any for household consumption, which has obviously nutritional implications because vegetables are still quite expensive. Not they're much more easily available now because North Andamans, especially, there's been a lot of vegetable cultivation in the past couple, whatever, few decades. But it's, yeah, it is a shift away from a largely marine-based sort of nutritive diet to other kinds of food. And the first question that you raised, I'm sorry, what was that?
I asked you about ecology and sustainability.
Right.
Right.
Thanks. Yeah. See, a lot of the fisheries in for actually very long time was sustainable in the islands. Simply because it was very small scale and the equipment used and the distances covered were all like very manageable, right? So though it was largely reef based fisheries, it was pretty sustainable. And in fact, I think the first trawlers came to mechanized fishing boats came only in 1908. So until then, it was, all manual sort of fishing, which means that, yeah, the quantities you caught or the distances that you went to catch your fish were all like pretty containable and within the sustainable limits. But again, this export market has changed the game. Also, with better storage and transport and connectivity, this temptation to export what you catch is obviously much more and also quite understandable because there are very few lucrative livelihoods in the islands. So that has changed the sustainability equation. And in recent times, the coral reefs have taken quite a hammering because between this sort of intensive fishing versus other, degradation in the form of, say, acidification of oceans, just entry of a lot of sewage and untreated waste into the nearshore waters. So with all of these problems together, it seems like the reefs are not in great shape, but I wouldn't attribute it entirely to marine resource use. It's a combination of things that has affected the sustainability of fisheries.
Right, right. So there's a similar question from Yashita, who is asking if
Development.
development-induced displacement and deforestation has changed the food consumption patterns and human-nature relations. There's one question before that as well, and it is about what fascinated you to study this and how do you look at the future? So I'll come to the next questions after you answer the, previous two. Yes.
Sure. So the reason I wanted to begin the study, like I mentioned earlier, is that one, I was a bit surprised that young people from the Andamans didn't seem to know much about their own ecology and history at all. They were all reading sort of mainland textbooks on these subjects. So I wanted to pick a topic that would be accessible to everybody and get them interested maybe in doing little projects and getting to know their own communities and landscapes better. The other reason was also I was very curious about the gender aspect of fisheries. Like, what do women think of marine resources? What is their understanding or knowledge of these things? Because a lot of fishery studies have just focused on the men because they look at catch, they look at gear and nets and how much does it cost to go and spend X amount of time at sea, those kinds of questions, right? So I wanted to know what do the women have to say about these things. So combination of these led me to begin this study. And I've also been very curious in terms of methods that a food waste study allows you to do, right? So we did a combination of interviews as well as oral histories. So we were able to capture a little bit of family history, a little bit of the backstory of who that woman was, who shared her recipes with us very generously. And most of them, in fact, were so excited. They say, "Oh, please use our real names. We don't you want to be anonymized or anything." They were very happy and excited about it. So it also, helped us look at it in a more sort of participatory method, really, because people contributed hugely to making this project take shape. And they were very excited when we went back and showed them the book. So these were some of the reasons that we decided to do this study. And that's also why I was very particular that I wanted to work with a research associate who was from the islands herself. And I was fortunate enough to find some who was interested in this and willing to work on this. So I think the second question was the one on development induced displacement and deforestation. Well,
Right.
to be honest, without deforestation, life would not have been possible in Andaman Islands, at least not for the settler communities. The original indigenous inhabitants were all forest-dwelling tribes, so they had a very different way of living, and they also depend quite a bit on marine resources. But for the settlers, especially, most of them were rice-eating communities who landed up in the islands, and they had to clear forests to grow some amount of paddy just to, keep the household going. And they also, were employed to work in the timber industry run by the British government. So it's not something new, but it's something historical. And I don't yeah. I mean, development induced displacement is a bit of a tricky question to take a position on in the islands because, to be honest, yes, from an environmental perspective, development is always a bit iffy. You're always calculating, what damage will it do to biodiversity and to the landscape. But the honest truth is that people also have a right to better infrastructure and facilities, right? And that's the catch in the Andamans, that there are very few options for improving the quality of life if you object to different kinds of development. So there's a definite need for more holistic, sustainable forms of development. But I wouldn't straight away jump into critiquing development per se or viewing it all through the lens of displacement. Because these are also people who are not just displaced from the mainlands due to inequalities and lack of access to resources here, but a lot of the migration was also aspirational. It's a combination of things. And then to further sort of restrict their access to a better quality of life seems a bit hard, historically speaking. So yeah, that that would sort of be my perspective on this, though I know it may not be shared by a lot of people who are sort of charmed by the beauty uh, of the ecosystems in the islands. Yeah.
Right, right. I think the next two questions kind of are related to what you were talking about. And the two questions are about exchange between settler cuisine and native or indigenous cuisine, and how different is the latter. And would you say that the islanders are slowly moving to the mainlanders' diet?
Yeah, the short answer to the diet question is that yes, that many islanders, especially the younger people, do seem to be eating a much more homogeneous diet. And the other thing that's pushing people to homogenize their diet, not just the exposure to tourism and therefore, paneer and chicken tikka and all of the usual things, is also the fact that the quality of the marine resources has degraded with time. Like many of the Bengali women who shared recipes told us how they'd hesitate to now eat freshwater fish from the little streams or tanks because they know that a lot of the vegetables are grown through use of fertilizers and pesticides, and the runoff enters all these water bodies. So they are themselves not very confident of eating this fish, though they are in many cases, it's their own relatives who are engaged in this kind of vegetable farming. And then the quality of the marine resources also has changed with time because especially after the tsunami, there were some fairly drastic structural changes to the coastline and the continental shelf around some of these places, which means certain kinds of fish were simply not available anymore. Certain kinds of shrimp, especially that the Karen women talked about, they said they had eaten as children, but they don't even see it anymore, and they attribute it to habitat changes after the tsunami. So there are these kinds of environmental come cultural factors that are pushing people to eat a much more mainstream diet. Is there exchange between settler and native cuisine? The honest answer to that is I don't know, because accessing indigenous communities there is very, very difficult. There are multiple layers of permission that you need, because they are still very vulnerable to illnesses from mainstream populations and fairly isolated tribes. So no, we didn't speak to any of the indigenous people at all. And from whatever few records I could find, it seems like they did quite a bit of refishing themselves, and they sort of baked fish over stones. That was, one of the details I found. But one similar thing which was very interesting was that there was a record in one of the British gazetteers about how the Andamanese, the Akabia, I think, hunted turtle and would cook the meat stuffed into bamboo tubes that were then cooked over the fire. And I found that very interesting, because I have actually worked with the Kadar community in the Western Ghats, who also stuff meat into bamboo tubes and cook it over the fire. And I think you see a very similar technique in the Northeast as well. So it just seems to be something that all forest dwelling communities, or many forest dwelling communities, seem to engage in. But I really don't know much more about what kind of interactions they might have been with respect to marine resources. In fact, some of the latest reports of the Anthropological Survey of India, I mean, by latest, I mean from the late 1990s onwards, are talking about the reverse, that a lot of interaction with the settlers has made whatever little pockets of indigenous communities are left, they are eating a little more masala, they're eating much more salt in their food, and they kind of, also cooking their meat much more than they used to. So that kind of percolation is happening, but it's not very clear if there's been any adoption of indigenous ways of consuming these resources.
I think one sees similar changes in Northeast India also from the kind of fieldwork, at least that I have done. One sees that there's a homogenization and you see a different kind of, landscape also. So we still have, a queue of questions. And there's one question on how do you think that food on the island is going to develop in the future? Do you anticipate that it will homogenize further and that some traditional recipes or food may even disappear entirely? Then there's a question about, as you talked about most of the dishes, they have fish as a prime ingredient. Are other marine living beings like octopus also popular? And what are the vegetarian dishes that can be found there? Are there seasonal recipes which would have been modified in the island by the settlers and more accepted widely by the indigenous communities?
Right. So what do I think is the future of island food? Well, I think a lot might actually depend on both the tourists and the young people. So when we circulated copies of this booklet to a couple of people in Port Blair who were not really part of the original audience I had in mind, because I had thought about, only the women who had contributed and fairly rural sort of youth. There was actually a lot of interest, and a couple of these people are in the tourism industry themselves in various capacities. They run, cafes or hotels or whatever, and they were really interested, which I thought was a very encouraging sign. And there was a bit of discussion about how maybe they would like to in future serve typical, islander cuisine rather than sort of go with the mainstream flow that tourists bring. So I found that very interesting. And there is also this community kitchen almost that's run in Middle Andamans by the Karen Crafts Cooperative. And they, in fact, run a restaurant that serves typical Karen food there. And they've actually had a very good response. So I think there are these little pockets of people who are interested in keeping traditional recipes alive, and hopefully that will also be, that will gather steam in the future. So I wouldn't sort of already anticipate extinction of some of these techniques or interests. And then in terms of do they eat other marine creatures? Yes, absolutely. Squid, octopus, shellfish of many kinds. All of these are consumed. Vegetarian food, well, is largely yeah, the regular vegetables and preparations that you get on the mainland. But some of the interesting twists that I have seen are that the Karens have hung on to their wild green foraging and sort of agroforestry, forest garden practices that they traditionally had in back in Myanmar. So they have some very unusual vegetables that they add to their food. And similarly, the Ranchiwalas have adapted to the local flora by, making chutneys and using different kinds of wild greens. Though sometimes confusingly, they're known by the same Baji names that are used in the mainland. But if you actually look at the species, it's, sometimes very different from what people in the mainland are consuming, but they're known by the same names. So that's an interesting thing. But again, the vegetarian wild green gathering, especially, is not terribly well documented, and that's probably another project waiting to be done. So, if anybody in this group is from the Andamans or would like to work there, that's a potential research topic. And yeah, so I think I answered that question about modifications of recipes. And more widely accepted by the indigenous communities, I honestly don't know, because access and interaction with the indigenous communities is very difficult. So I have not worked with them at all. My work has entirely been with the settler communities. Do you find significant relations on social and power hierarchies? Do you mean, are there, is there food preferences that are very tightly linked to caste or class? The interesting thing in the islands is because many people went there as, as political prisoners of the British. There is a huge sense of solidarity amongst a lot of these old islander families. So more than saying, I am Bihari or you're Bengali or whatever, or, whatever your caste is, the primary identification is we come from families that were very ferocious and had fought for independence, and there's this great sense of pride in being an Indian and an islander at that. So that seems to be the thing that people first talk about, and therefore all of them told us about this Matsya Surwa and how they think it's very typical of. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, please keep your mics muted. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So, yeah, so I don't think there is as much caste or regional stratification as you would see in the mainland. Because the sense of sociality is very different in the islands, or at least has been until recently. We don't know, yeah, what the future might hold. But so far, yeah, you don't see those kinds of prescriptions and prescriptions that are very common on the mainland. Um, Somebody is seeking, Roshni has asked me about their local medicine. Wow, that's an interesting question, Roshni, but I'm afraid I don't quite know much about about local medicinal systems. I'm sorry.
Right. No, it's okay. Is there any other question? Okay, then, since there are no other questions, let me thank Dr. Ramesh for this very wonderful talk and the Q&A, for engaging all of us in kind of food history, as well as like tracing the trajectory of food amongst the settler communities in the Andamans. And the talk will be uploaded in the YouTube channel of Indian Sociological Society some days later. So if you want to catch it, you can, visit the YouTube site. I've also shared the membership links of the RC policy. And if you're interested, you can join. Thank you, everyone, for attending the talk today. And thank you to our speaker for giving us this time.